Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar from Didomi about the Transparency and Content Framework version 2 that was released back in August. I'm Jawad Stouli. I'm the CTO here at Didomi. I've been with the company since the beginning a few years ago, and I oversee product and engineering. The IAB Europe, the Techlab, all its members like Didomi and other companies as well have been hard at work over the last 6 months to implement the TCF v2 that was formalized and released back in August 2019. And in this webinar, we're going to be talking about the TCF itself with a quick recap of what it was and what purposes it serves. The version 2 of the TCF, the new features that are embedded in there, what's in there for publishers, for vendors, and then how to implement that TCF version 2 with Didomi. The slides and the replay of this webinar will be available after we're done. We'll public on YouTube. You'll be able to share it with colleagues, coworkers, whoever you think would be interested in TCF v2. So don't stress too much, and let's get started. So the Transparency and Content Framework is a standard that was created about 2 years ago in 2018 by the IAB Europe and the IAB Techlab. The IAB Europe being in charge of the policy side of things, and the IAB Techlab being in charge of the technical side of things. And the role of the framework is to standardize how content is being collected and transmitted across the digital and advertising industry. So it standardizes the role of a content management platform like Didomi, which is about collecting content, displaying different types of UIs to the user, and then sharing that content to the major players in the industry that have adopted the framework. Over the last 2 years, we've had a lot of different players adopting the framework that has become the de facto standard in the digital advertising industry for both collecting and sharing content. So the framework also standardizes a set of purposes that all the industry has agreed on as being the pillar of online advertising and being the list that users have to agree to before advertising can happen, usually targeted advertising more specifically. The standard also standardizes how content is collected and then how it's shared and transmitted between different ad tech players, from the publisher, who's usually in charge of that initial content collection, all the way to the demand side, who might be using personal data for targeted advertising, as well as any other intermediary along the chain that might be using personal data for targeting, attribution, any type of digital advertising use case is covered here. So the framework has had massive adoption and success over the last 2 years, and about a year ago, a little bit less than that, the IAB Europe and Techlab got together to work on an improved version of the TCF for mostly 2 reasons. The first one was to incorporate feedback from European DPAs, data protection authorities, that have been looking at how content is collected online and that have been publishing guidelines around how to improve that, as well as consumer advocacy groups and the digital advertising industry, some of the major players that had feedback and comments on how things were done in TCF v1. And the second big reason to work on a new version of TCF was to offer more information and choices to end users, particularly around legitimate interest. We'll talk about that later on. And also give more control to publishers who, as the main content collection point, would need to have a little bit more control around how things are being done on their websites and mobile apps. And so overall, this is all giving more control and more choices to the user, especially more information on the type of purposes that data processing will be run on, as well as giving them more information around legitimate interest. So we'll dive into all of that in more details right now. The IAB TCF v2 basically comes with an updated list of purposes. In particular, it comes with 10 purposes instead of the original 5 ones. As you can see here on the left side will be the 5 purposes that were in the TCF v1 and that have been succeeded by 10 now in the TCF v2 that are mostly breaking down the 5 v1 purposes to offer more granular choices to the user. So 10 purposes is the new standard in TCF v2, and 2 what's called special purposes, which are specific purposes with legitimate interest legal basis and that cannot be controlled directly from the CMP. So users are able to exercise the right to object, but we need to do so directly on the vendor's websites, whereas for all the other purposes, the user can agree or disagree based on consent or legitimate interest and make those choices directly from the CMP and from the publisher's website. One exception there is the purpose number 1, the store and or access information on device, which was already there in the TCF v1. That one basically means cookies or information storage on mobile devices, and those are that purpose becomes consent-based for any TCF v2 vendor, any TCF v2 data processing that might happen, which aligns it pretty well with some recent guidelines there in terms of what a legal basis is required for cookies. And then another change in terms of the data processing that are covered by the TCF v2 and what information needs to be displayed to the user is around what's called features and special features. So features were already there in the TCF v1. They were a set of data processing that might be done by vendors as a complement to purposes that a user might give consent to. So for instance, using geolocation data might be done for personalized advertising, assuming the user gave consent for personalized advertising. So they were somewhat attached to purposes, but were not purposes themselves, and did not give the user an option to agree or disagree or opt in or opt out at the time. The TCF v2 introduces one new feature here, the number 3, receive and use automatically send device characteristic for identification. It keeps the first 2 features that were already there, and it introduces a new category, which is called the special features, which allows users to opt in or opt out of those special features. So the features themselves stay the same, which is that the obligation under TCF v2 is disclosure only, so those need to be displayed to the user, but the user cannot make any choice with respect to those features. Special features themselves have an opt-in option where the user can opt in or opt out of those special features. So they are akin to a purpose from a behavior perspective and from a user perspective. The legal basis is not consent nor legitimate interest in this case. So we have a total of 4 entities here that comprise the core of the TCF v2, basically the purpose, special purposes, features, and special features, which are much more detailed list of all types of entities here to get more information and granular choices to the user. The main new features that were introduced by the TCF v2 on top of those special features and special purposes, I think we've identified 3 that are the most important. The first one is a better support for legitimate interest. So we now allow the user to directly exercise the right to objects on through the CMP, so directly on the publisher website, whereas previously the user had to go to the privacy policies of every vendor out there and specifically exercise the right to object. There's no an option directly in the CMP to exercise that right for users. It also means there is all this technical standard behind that to be able to pass legitimate interest information from the CMP, from the publisher side, all the way down to the demand side and to all the vendors. That means there was an update to the consent string there to be able to encode both consent-based information, but also legitimate interest-based information. And that legitimate interest choice applies to both purposes, where the user can make choices at the purpose level based on consent or legitimate interest, but also to every vendor, where the user can object to every vendor specifically and to all their purposes based on legitimate interest. So there's a pretty broad support for legitimate interest there. We also added, that's on the Didomi side, we added some extra language around disclosure to the user that legitimate interest is being used as a legal basis by some of the vendors or potentially the current website that the user is on. And that provides for a much bigger and a much better information for the user in terms of legitimate interest, which was one of the requirements from the DPAs that has come up again and again in all the guidelines we've looked at recently. The second big change is the legal basis for cookies. So I touched on that a little bit in the previous slides, the idea being that for the cookies purpose or for storage and access of information on a device, the only acceptable legal basis under the TCF v2 is now consent, and legitimate interest is not an option anymore, which we think represents very fairly the position of the majority of the DPAs or European DPAs out there. There is a small exception to that, depending on how you want to process that purpose number 1, but that depends on publisher choice, and so it's possible to enforce that as a publisher and to decide that that's the new rule that you want to enforce as a publisher. And the third big improvement there that we've seen is what's called publisher restrictions. The idea being that publishers get a little more control on what purposes can be on their websites or what vendors can collect consent for on the website, and how what legal basis those vendors can use for those data processing. So publishers now have really 2 types of choices. The first one is they can forbid a vendor from using a specific purpose entirely. So they might say that vendor number 1 or 2 or 3 or whatever cannot do this very specific purpose in data processing on their website, no matter the legal basis used for it. And then the second option that is now offered to publishers is for them to express some set of restrictions on the legal basis used by vendors for purposes. So vendors can define what's called flexible purposes, where they indicate that they can do it either based on consent and or legitimate interest, and then publishers can make further choices when multiple legal bases are possible. So that's also a pretty big change for publishers, where they're given more control on what happens on their websites and in their mobile apps, and they have more ways to restrict vendors' actions on those. So we're going to be talking about the migration calendar now a little bit. So the TCF v2 policies and tech spec were released back in August 2019. Since then, the IAB has been doing a lot of webinars, a lot of training, and all the vendors and CMPs have been working on building out the support for the framework. The official release calendar and migration calendar from the IAB here basically indicates that from March 31st to April 30th is a beta period for vendors where they are allowed to be testing traffic for the TCF v2 in production. That also means most CMPs are releasing support during the month of April or early May, just like Didomi is, and that basically allows vendors and CMPs to run more tests together. We've been testing with vendors for the last few months in pre-prod environments, and we've started testing in production environments with vendors as well since the beginning of this month. Didomi has released support for TCF v2 for web at the beginning of the month. And so by the end of April, the idea is that CMPs and vendors have had time to test and validate all their integrations. No publisher should not go live with a v2 implementation before May, basically, as April is still more of a transition/testing month than an actual production release month. And then May and June is the v1 to v2 transition period, with publishers switching effectively in production their support from v1 to v2, and CMPs and vendors having production versions released out there. End of June is the end of the TCF v1 support, so vendors would not be required to support v1 anymore at that point. In May and June, vendors will basically be expected to support both v1 and v2 depending on the websites or mobile apps they're on, with a parallel option for both versions to run. So the timeline on our side is pretty much aligned on that at Didomi. So we're running tests with publishers, vendors, and our CMP during the month of April. We're releasing support for apps early May 2020, and then May and June will be at the time for migrating production environments until the end of June. So we're pretty aligned on the TCF on the IAB TCF calendar there. All right, so we'll be now talking a little bit more about the TCF v2 specific migration options with Didomi, how it actually works, what the actual steps are, and give you more of a step-by-step walkthrough of how to get to a v2 deployment when you either already have a v1 deployment, or even if you don't have a v1 consent notice, you can obviously start directly with a v2 with Didomi starting May 2020. So the main changes that we've implemented in the Didomi CMP to support the v2 are basically supporting the new purposes from the IAB, as well as all the special features and features that were listed, as well as an option to list to group purposes in our different UIs to give users an easier way to look at them. The idea being that 10 or 12 different purposes gets a little bit overwhelming for users. The second thing we added is support for legitimate interest for purposes and vendors. And then also spent a fair amount of work on supporting all the tech spec and underlying the TCF v2. So updating the TCF v2 API on mobile and web, and then also updating to the constant string v2. So I'll be walking through how those different pieces are supported in the Didomi platform. So the very first step you have to take as a publisher or as a client using our CMP would be to go into the console, enable support for the TCF version 2. So we have that available directly in the integration step. So here, basically in the integration step of your banner, you can basically choose between the version 1 and the version 2. Your standard notice would be on version 1, and then enabling version 2 would give you an option to test how version 2 is performing with your websites. As mentioned, do not deploy version 2 in production content notices, as the support is not really final from vendors until the end of the month. So enabling the support for V2 is really as simple as that, switching from V1 to V2. They will automatically enable support for the framework on your websites and in your mobile apps. The second step there would be to then choose your updated list of vendors for the TCF V2. So a lot of vendors have made the transition from V1 to V2. Not all of them are there yet, although we do expect most of them to get there. So you'll be seeing an updated list here. You'll be able to choose the V2 vendors that you want to support. Most likely you want to go with the exact same ones as what you had in V1 minus the ones that don't support V2 yet. So you don't necessarily have to update anything, but you have the option to make different choices for the V2 vendor list. You also always have the option to choose to support all vendors, in which case we'll automatically sync the list of vendors deployed on your website with the IAB vendor list as supported by the IAB. So that should also be that should also go pretty smoothly with the everything doable from the console UI to move a content notice V1 to a V2 pretty easily. We also introduced a new option to support displaying the list of data processing and purposes directly in the notice being the very first screen here of the CMP, where the user gets most of their information. And so this new block here allows you to keep an automatically updated list of purposes. So the Didomi will make sure that this list is always up to date. If you add new vendors, if you add new purposes in your console, they will automatically be reflected here. That answers a requirement from the TCF itself, which is making sure that all the purposes that you're collecting content for or that you might be using for data processing based on legitimate interest are all listed on this very first initial layer, so what we call the notice here. Also answers requirements from a lot of DPAs that have this exact same requirement that all the purposes be explicitly listed to the user for the consent to be valid. So we have automated this process and it's available immediately in the console as an option for existing consent notices, and it's automatically enabled for new consent notices. From a purely practical perspective, it's also acceptable to list your own elements here. You don't necessarily have to use this automatically generated list of purposes. You can manage your own list in your own text. That's also perfectly acceptable from a legal perspective. That also gives me a chance to talk about the stacks from the TCF. So the idea was that because this list gets to be a little bit long for the user and a little bit overwhelming, those purposes can be grouped together into what's called stacks under the TCF. And so stacks are list of purposes that are grouped together into categories and that are standardized by the IAB TCF. So there is a fixed list of 37 stacks that you can choose from to display. Instead of having the full list of purposes here, you could display maybe 3, 4, or 5 different stacks that will be grouping those purposes together. So stack can be freely chosen and freely added to your notice. There is no restriction around them. The only real restriction from the IAB is that in the initial layer, you're either listing the purposes themselves or listing stacks picked from the IAB list. You cannot create your own custom stacks. From a practical perspective, you could, but it gets a lot more complicated from a requirement perspective. As a publisher, you will need to register as a separate CMP, get your own CMP ID to be able to use your own non-standard stacks. So the key takeaway here is you want to either display the full list of purposes or a specifically chosen list of stacks, but not your own, basically not your own stacks. That's also pretty important from a TCF perspective. Another option that we opened as part of TCF V2 was being able to group purposes into categories. So in the same idea as tax sensor, this problem of having too many purposes here, we have the same issue when you get more information as a user, where you also have a lot of purposes here to deal with. So we have added an option to group those into what we call categories. So you'll be able to create your own custom category here to change how the purpose preferences view is being displayed, and that gives you an option to basically group those purposes together in pieces that are more easily digestible for the user. Those are separate from stacks in the sense that they do not apply to the same views, and then categories will be displayed to users as well. But this is optional, but it's also a good option to give users more information and an easier way of dealing with all the information that is thrown at them to some extent. So that would be an example of a preferences view with categories there. This is an example here of categories being listed under it. So, and those can be controlled directly from the Didomi console as well. So in terms of legitimate interest support, the good news is there is nothing to set up on a publisher website. Everything is automatically taken care of by the Didomi CMP. So as long as you select your vendors correctly in your vendor list, we'll automatically make sure that for every purpose that has a dual legal basis potentially, we'll be collecting consent and legitimate interest separately, with legitimate interest being more of an opt-out based option than consent, where it's a right to object more than a consent-based choice. So that's at the purpose level, where users can now make choices on consent or legitimate interest. And then separately at the vendor level, we also have surfaced all that information from the IAB, where you'll have vendors, you'll have data processing based on consent, the option for users to authorize or block those data processing based on consent, which was already there in the V1, and then similarly in the V2, you now have an option to have data processing based on legitimate interest, and have options for the user to either authorize or block those in the same way. So exercising the right to object directly from the CMP here is obviously a major improvement for users themselves. And I can see on the chat there's a question around providing default categories to group purposes. So that's something we are working on, most likely through the IAB stack, where we'll give you an easy way to use the stacks as a grouping for categories. So we'll recommend at that point the console will have an option to automatically group your purposes into categories, into a set of standardized categories to match what you could display in the notice. So that's definitely something we're working on, not available at the moment yet in the console, but definitely something that will be available later this month or early May. So there's a question around legal basis for non-global vendor list third-party cookies. That's an interesting question, which is how do you define purposes and legal basis for non-GVL cookies? So at the moment, and the way we've worked historically was to say that the cookies are always legal based on consent. So in the Didomi console, when you would create a new vendor associated with cookie-related purposes, those would be always based on consent. And to some extent, that is still pretty much how this works here, where you have the where the only option you have for cookies specifically is to have them be based on consent. One option that we are adding that should be released pretty soon in the coming weeks is being able to define purposes as being required. So under e-privacy, there is one exception to that consent legal basis, which is required cookies. Required meaning technical cookies. And so those will be fully supported as well, where you'll be able to mark some cookies as being required, and then consent will not be collected for those, and they'll be clearly indicated to the user as being required. I don't have an example handy, but the idea would be to eventually would be to say that you'll have two options in the Didomi platform for managing cookies. One is having them consent-based. That's historically what was possible, and that's what's required under the TCF v2 for IAB vendors. And then for non-IAB vendors and non-IAB cookies, there will be the option to do technical cookies as well, with no consent being collected there. And also no option for the user to opt out of them being collected cookies. So that's the two type of legal basis or choices we'll support for users, basically there. All right, so that's how we're dealing with new legal basis, basically, with a lot of emphasis being put on legitimate interest, which was the big missing piece of the TCF v1, and it's great that it's finally correctly managed in TCF. They'll definitely make a lot of DPAs happy. A lot of publishers it will make publishers work a lot easier from that perspective. So once those choices have been made in the console UI, and once you have tested and validated your version 2 integration, you will need to update the Didomi SDK. So on the web, you'll need to get a new embed code and replace your existing embed code on your website. The reason being that part of the code is what we call the stub. The stub indicates to vendors that there's a CMP on the page, and that they should wait for the CMP to be ready. And so that stub has changed with the V2. So there is an updated embed code that you'll find there. You don't need to do that change until you go to production with your V2. You can do tests, you can do everything without updating the code. But once you're ready to go, you should update that code from V1 to V2 The stub's main goal is to increase the consent rate that is effectively seen by your vendors. So it makes sure that more vendors get the consent. Without the stub, you'll see a lower consent rate, but you might still see things working. So it's not critical to do it as you're testing, but it is critical to do it when you're ready to go live. Same for the mobile SDKs. We'll be releasing a new version in May with support for the TCF v2 that you'll need to deploy, and then everything can be controlled from the console in the same way as the web, but you'll need an initial update to the mobile SDKs there. One point that is still open is support for AMP. There is no support for AMP at the moment. The main question being passing the consent string between CMPs and vendors and AMP is always a little bit more complicated than in regular web, and AMP support was released, I think, from Google at the end of 2019. So it's pretty recent evolution. So we're watching the situation, talking with Google on when support for the V2 would be available, and we'll align there as soon as possible. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a very practical solution there. So as soon as possible, we really support for AMP, but it's just not there yet from the framework perspective. And then last point, from a migration perspective, you will want to retest your integrations and spend a lot of time making sure that everything still works as expected. After updating the SDKs, we usually have 3-4 different types of integrations with vendors that we see on websites or mobile apps. We'll have IAB TCF vendors. For those, there's nothing specific for you to do. Everything's taken care of by the framework. We are working with the main vendors at the moment on validating that our tags and their tags work well together. So for all the major players out there, there will be nothing for you to do. For vendors that are somewhat smaller in size, unfortunately, it's a little bit harder for us to validate everyone. So either reach out to them or to us, and we can spend time on validating them more specifically. But you do want to make sure that all your TCF vendors continue getting the consent string with the V2 just as they did with the V1. DFP is also a separate case today. Google has publicly committed to joining the V2, but it hasn't released any public date on support for the V2 in DFP or Google Ad Manager yet. From what we're seeing, most of their information comes first from the demand side and then trickles down to the publisher side. So, until Google officially releases support for the V2 into DFP and Google Ad Manager, you'll still want to make sure your Google integrations work as expected. There shouldn't be any change there, but you do want to retest them just in case. Tag Manager integrations also shouldn't see too many changes. Everything's still the same, but you just want to double check that nothing has broken there. The one thing that you want to be careful about is that purposes are changing, and that also means purpose IDs are changing. And in a lot of those integrations, that doesn't matter, but some of our publishers will sometimes have specific code calling the Didomi API or specific variables in their Google Tag Manager or any tag manager they might be using. And whenever that's the case, you want to make sure that if you have a condition on those purposes, then you update your purpose ID. If you're checking whether a vendor has consent, then you're always good to go with that. If you're not checking on vendors, but you're checking on purpose-based, then you might want to make sure that those are still as expected because the purpose IDs are changing. The purpose ID 1 is not changing. It's still cookies on our platform and will remain as is. So that's a good news because that's also the main purpose ID that's usually used. But any other purpose, make sure you double check your custom code there or tag manager integration just to make sure it's not breaking anything. Saying another question here around the confirmed vendors. So that's a good point. We haven't publicized the list yet on our side. That's something that I think we'll be adding to our knowledge base or support website on support.didomi.io. We have a few migration articles there, and we'll definitely be adding the list of vendors that we have officially worked with and confirmed that the integration worked as expected there. So we'll definitely be adding that in the coming days or weeks, hopefully. So that's what I was referring about on this website here. You have a few articles around this migration. So a lot of what we discussed in this webinar is addressed there. You'll have the whole calendar as well as a migration guide for web, and then the migration guide for apps will come soon. It walks you through all those steps as well as gives you a little bit more technical details around some of those steps. And that's also where we'll be adding the list of vendors that we have officially validated or that have officially validated their integration with us. Another small another few points here that we see coming up pretty often. First one is the best recommendation we can make is once you transition over to V2, stay in V2. The going back to V1 is technically possible in the console. You can always switch back, but you have to do all the steps in the other direction. So if you don't have anything custom, no custom integration, switching from V1 to V2 or from V2 to V1 is somewhat straightforward. So it's okay to switch back. If you have complicated custom code that uses our API and stuff like that, then once you transition over to V2, going back to V1 will be somewhat complicated. So the transition is a big step from that perspective. So keep that in mind. The second point that is important is there is because all the purposes are new under the V2, except maybe for the cookies or the information storage purpose that is almost similar, although slightly different. The decision that has been made by the IAB is to do a complete recollection of consent for V2. So once you switch from V1 to V2, all the notices will automatically pop up again and consent will be collected again. So that's also one thing to keep in mind and not to be surprised about, that all your users will have to give consent again at that point. V1 and V2 cannot be used in parallel. So vendors that are only V1 ready will lose consent when you switch to V2. That one is pretty important because it also means that when you switch, you want to make sure that most of your vendors and most of the vendors that are tied to your revenue need to be switched to V2 as well. Otherwise, you might have a lot of issues there. There is no backward compatibility in the sense that once a user has given consent for V2, we cannot create a V1 consent string with information and continue giving that information out to vendors. That is technically possible, but wasn't allowed by the IAB at this point. So that's one big point here that makes it all the more important to retest integrations and make sure you evaluate with vendors that the integrations work as expected. Seeing a few more questions here. The first one being, is it mandatory to switch to V2? So it is mandatory to switch to V2. The deadline currently is June 2020. The reason being that first, it's complicated for vendors and CMPs to maintain multiple versions, and also all the advantages brought by V2 were important enough that the IAB decided to make it compulsory. The deadline is June 30 for all publishers, all vendors, all CMPs at this point. A lot of, in all our internal discussions with the IAB, a lot of publishers and vendors and CMPs have been asking for more time. Given both recent and global events, but also because it is a major transition that does require time. At the moment, the date is June 2020, and that hasn't changed. So the second question I'm seeing is, can we use V2 for websites and V1 for AMP? The answer is yes. The way our console works is you usually create separate consent notices by platform, so web versus AMP versus mobile. And so you do those transitions separately, and you can have a V2 website and a V1 AMP notice. On AMP, the situation is a little bit more complicated, obviously. We're discussing with vendors on what V2 support will be like. If needed, we'll talk with the IAB around how to support V1 potentially after June 2020 if Google hasn't provided a technical solution for supporting V2 in AMP. Obviously, the issue is kind of like out of our hands from a technical perspective, so we're just looking at how to make sure that if required, vendors can still collect V1 in AMP. That's the only thing we can do after June 2020, basically. So we'll be communicating more on that in May and June as we get more information from everyone, but that's something we're monitoring closely and making sure that we're not breaking anything by switching AMP to V2 when vendors are not supporting V2, basically. All right, so I think we're basically at the end of the webinar here. We have a few more minutes for questions. If you have any more questions, please feel free to send them. More generally, if you have, how about cross domains? Must all sites go to V2 at once? That's a very good question. The answer is yes. Let me take that back. The answer is actually kind of. The way the V2 works is we use a separate cookie for V2. So there's a different cookie name that will be stored. EU consent was the name of the cookie for the consent string in V1. I think EU consent 2 is the name for the V2, the IAB V2. So technically, you can have websites on V1 and websites on V2. They will not be sharing content at that point. Is the main issue, right? Like if you have a website on V1 and a website on V2, and you're doing cross-domain content, at that point they will be collecting content separately. So it will still work. It won't break anything, but it will break the cross-domain nature of things. If you move sites slowly, then you'll have sites on V2 working together, and then another group of sites on V1 working together. And as you move towards the V2, all your sites will be on the same version. So we would recommend moving to the V2 and aligning your website's transition as much as possible. Obviously, it's not practical to say we'll move everything in the same hour, in the same second. So that's not what we're talking about, but try to avoid having weeks of transition between all your websites that are sharing content across domains. Will make your life much easier, and will also make the user experience better from that perspective. Cool. All right. So yeah, if you have any question, obviously after this webinar, feel free to reach out to our support team on support@didomi.io. You're also welcome to reach out to me personally with my email address here. We have, one thing we've been seeing a lot of the TCF V2 implementation was we're deeply convinced it goes in the right direction from a DPA's perspective, and that to us is the most important thing out there, which is data protection authorities in Europe are happy with the direction that the TCF V2 is taking. And it is pretty well aligned with some recent recommendations from the CNIL, for instance, on how content needs to be collected, on how legitimate interest needs to be surfaced. And so that's pretty important there. Another small point I wanted to touch on as a conclusion here is this white paper here that we have recently published on From Privacy to Preference. As a CMP, we're obviously fully dedicated to supporting advertising and cookies in terms of content collection and user choices. But we're also looking at a lot of other use cases around direct communication to users, so questions around marketing, direct marketing, emailing, and things like that. And so we're paving the way to a more integrated content management there that would include cookies and advertising, but also more generally any other type of communication and exchange you might have with users. So we've released this white paper on this exact topic, which you're welcome to read from didomi.io. So seeing a couple of other questions here from the chat, and I might have missed some from the questions tab, so I'll go back right after this. So one was about, do we expect any impact with the cookieless initiative? That's a good question. I think the trend overall is that less and less third-party cookies will be out there, and to some extent, less and less first-party cookies will be out there. If you look at the most recent ITP iteration from Safari from end of March, there are also killing client-side, or if not killing, limiting client-side cookies, so that will also hamper the content collection from that perspective. So the impacts there are usually a potential impact on cross-domain, where sharing content across domains will get harder and harder through domains and not through identified users. And so that has been kind of like the long-term trend. First-party content collection is mostly unaffected or has good technical solutions to work around. And then on the cookieless initiative, assuming cookieless here refers to some of the IAB initiatives as well. So, it's an industry question. It's an advertising question of how do we work with less cookies. When you look at initiatives like Privacy Sandbox from Google around putting more of the advertising responsibility from the browser in terms of creating segments, creating audiences, things like that. I think content definitely is an open question there. I would be lying if I said that we know exactly where that is going. What we're seeing, I think, is one thing is more things are going into the browser and less cookies are available. And so as a CMP, our job is to make sure that however that evolves, constant keep being collected with respect to regulations, the IAB TCF, and then our publishers are covered and can continue working with all their vendors. The way we're approaching this is, however this evolves from a technical perspective, as long as we find a way to keep those principles and make sure that they are correctly respected and keep everyone happy on the user side and on the compliance side, we're in good shape. And that's basically our job as a company. Another question on, do we have to ask for content again when switching to V2? The answer is yes, because purposes are not compatible between V1 and V2, even though they're somewhat of a broken down version of V1 purposes. The decision has been made to recollect content for every single user out there when you switch to V2. So that's done the website or app level. Whenever you switch to your content notice to V2, will automatically recollect content for all your users irrespective of their previous choices. Yeah, a lot of people might not like some of these choices. You know, some of them, most of them are obviously IAB driven. I understand where they're coming from. I think they make sense from an IAB perspective and from an industry perspective. Obviously, I also understand as a having been at Didomi 3 years, having worked with a lot of publishers, that sometimes those create complicated incentives or constraints on publishers. You know, it's a two-faced coin. It is a lot of constraint. It is a lot of work for everyone involved. It has also solved a massive issue, which is constant in the advertising industry. If the TCF had not been there 2 years ago, we would have been in a much worse place. So, you know, I understand the constraints are big. I understand it's a lot of work for everyone involved. We should also keep in mind how much it brought to the industry, and to some extent, how much of the revenue it has helped save to everyone involved there from that perspective. That's also an interesting thing to keep in mind. Another small point here around if we don't use the Didomi console, yes, you can do everything we've shown in the Didomi console. Everything I've shown in the Didomi console can be done through the code as usual. You know, we support that window, that Didomi config object, configuration object on the web. We support that Didomi config file on mobile. Those have been, we've updated the documentation for those on developers.didomi.io. If we've missed anything, you know, feel free to reach out and we'll correct that, but everything should be there. And as usual, everything that's doable from the console is also doable directly on your websites or in the mobile apps through the direct tag configuration. We still recommend people moving to the console. I think from a practical perspective, it's usually more comfortable, but you know, we're also cognizant of the fact that you might not want or might not be able to at this point. So it's also okay to keep your existing setup and just upgrade to the V2 from there. So that's in our developers documentation, and I'm assuming the support website that was listed here would also have direct links to some of that documentation there as needed. Otherwise, you know, feel free to reach out. We'll point you in the right direction and update whatever might be missing there. I think we're at time, so we'll stop here for today. Thanks a lot to everyone for attending. We'll be, as I mentioned, we'll be sharing the slides and the recording later on, so you can take another look if you want to share it. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out directly to me or to our support team. We know it's a big change, so we'll get through that together, and we'll be happy to answer any other question you might have. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.